Hello, my name is John Cobourn. I'm a water resource specialist, retired from University of Nevada Reno Extension. I want to talk for a short time about the different responses that we as a society can make to climate change. Uh, in particular, I want to look at the differences between the causes of climate change and the effects. They're both important, but the way that we respond to the effects is really different from the efforts that we need to make to address the causes. So I'm not going to introduce very much new technology or terminology right now, but going to talk about some of the terms that have already been brought up and try to lay some emphasis on the differences between the different responses to put them in perspective. Well, since the topic for today's Watershed Wednesday is climate resilience, and we're going to be looking specifically, some of the talks are going to be about agriculture. I wanted to start by just mentioning that back in 2015, I worked with Steve Lewis in Extension. We held drought workshops during that long 4-year drought for ranchers and farmers in this local area. And we did administer a survey to find out what their thoughts were about climate, whether the climate is changing, and we asked specific questions. And the responses, 17 of 19 respondents said temperatures over the past 50 years have been gradually getting warmer. Secondly, 20 of 20 respondents said that surface water supplies for agriculture will decrease in the next 20 years. And 19 of 19 respondents said that groundwater supplies for agriculture will also decrease in the next 20 years. So even though climate change has been somewhat controversial, local farmers and ranchers see that it is happening, and even as long as 6 years ago. Now, since the topic of today's presentations is climate resilience, I thought I would give at least one definition of that term, climate resilience. It's the ability of key economic and social systems to anticipate, prepare for, and respond to climate change effects. This would include climate proofing for the future, being prepared for the next flood, drought, heat wave, or wildfire. These measures are also sometimes called climate adaptation. Brenda Hunt asked me to step back a little bit to look at climate change in terms of what are the main ways or the two categories that encompass ways that we respond to climate change. And there are really two main categories. One, we can respond to the effects of climate change, and the other, we can respond to the causes of climate change. In responding to the effects of climate change, it means we want to prepare for warmer temperatures and extreme weather. An example of that would be planting crops that are more suitable for warmer temperatures and droughts. And this is generally called adaptation, although some people refer to it as resilience. We should respond to both the effects and the causes of climate change. And the causes of climate change, we need to reduce and stabilize the amount of greenhouse gases in the atmosphere. We need to slow and stop greenhouse gas emissions in order to prevent a total rise in average global temperatures of more than 2 degrees Celsius. And this approach is known as mitigation. Well, I'd like to take a moment now to talk about why adaptation and mitigation are both so important, and to put it in this context. The International Panel on Climate Change, or the IPCC, which is the largest group of scientists in the world, and they've been working on global warming for decades, they issued a report 2 years ago on what it would take to limit the total global warming in terms of average temperatures of the globe to only 1.5 degrees Celsius above pre-industrial levels. Global temperatures, average temperatures have risen about 1 degree so far since about 1850. That doesn't sound like much. It's 1.7 degrees Fahrenheit, but it has a big impact. Now, the Paris Climate Agreement, or Paris Climate Accord of 2015, all the nations in the world, most nations signed it with the goal of doing whatever it takes for mitigation in order to limit the total rise of average temperatures to no more than 2 degrees Celsius. And they did that because most scientists that study this agree that beyond 2 degrees Celsius, you get to 2.5 degrees or 3 degrees Celsius, global warming is really going to be catastrophic to many parts of the world. Now, limiting the rise to 1.5 degrees Celsius would require rapid and far-reaching transitions in energy sources, land, infrastructure, transportation, buildings, and industrial systems. This would require mitigation on all those areas, and mitigation is hard. So the point here is that it really is important that we do both adaptation and mitigation, and we really take it seriously. And luckily here in Nevada, the new state climate strategy is very good in terms of identifying a lot of places in our society, in our economy in Nevada, where we can do a lot for mitigating climate change. Okay, so I want to now look at those two terms again and review and actually drill down and look a little more closely at how those are defined and really what they entail. So mitigation, as I mentioned, it addresses the causes of global climate change, and it involves reducing and stabilizing the flow of heat-trapping greenhouse gases into the atmosphere. And everybody's heard of greenhouse gases. These definitions are from NASA. In addition to reducing the flow of emissions of greenhouse gases, it also includes enhancing the sinks that accumulate and store or sequester these gases, such as the oceans, the forests, and the soil. And we're actually going to talk today some about how agriculture can actually take carbon out of the atmosphere and put it in the soil where it does more good. Adaptation is, as I've already defined, means adapting our communities to climate change effects that are already on the way. And we really need both. The point is we really need both. And well, after all that talk about mitigation and adaptation and how important it is that we address the causes of global warming and actually try to slow and stop global warming through mitigation, we finally get to the role of carbon. And this is important because so much of our language these days about mitigation has to do with carbon. And at first I didn't get it. I heard a talk way back in 2015 of a guy talking about a carbon tax, and I went, "What the heck's a carbon tax?" Well, this was at a conference in Montana, and Steve Lewis was with me, and he got it and said to me afterwards, that the role of carbon is really huge, and he made so much sense in terms of increasing the price of fuels that have carbon in them. So at that point, I started to learn a little bit about the role of carbon and studied a little more, talked with Steve a little more, and it came very clear to me that the whole idea of greenhouse gases trapping heat is dependent because the worst culprit in greenhouse gases is carbon dioxide. Carbon dioxide is great for plants, and we exhale carbon dioxide when we breathe out. But if it gets too much of it in the atmosphere, it heats up the planet like a greenhouse. So there are other greenhouse gases that include, in addition to carbon dioxide, we have methane and nitrogen, even water vapor, nitrogen oxides, and they block the heat that the Earth absorbs and then tries to radiate it back out into space, and it traps it before it can get out into space. These greenhouse gases are GHG. Carbon dioxide is a primary component. That's why we refer to the effects of carbon on the climate. And you hear things like carbon footprint and carbon neutral. And that's a goal, to become carbon neutral by 2050. So that's why and for this is review for probably most of you, but for people that haven't really delved into this and done much reading about it, this is an important, a very important. Well, now that we've talked about how carbon dioxide's the most destructive greenhouse gas, I like looking at a graphic like this that shows the sun's energy coming down from the left into Earth, and the solar radiation passes through the atmosphere and it heats up the Earth. Well, some of that heat from the Earth, since the Earth gets warmer, it actually radiates the heat and it goes back up into and once basically before we had greenhouse gases, it would have been radiated right out back into space. But that greenhouse gas layer in the middle with carbon dioxide and methane and other gases prevents that from happening. So this is a good schematic, and I will show one. But this is actually a little bit simpler graphic. It's very similar. It shows the sun at the top with the solar radiation coming to the Earth with the white arrows, and then the orange arrows represent that heat energy that was absorbed by the land and the oceans being radiated back up towards space and being intercepted and actually taken up by those greenhouse gases, which then radiate some of that heat back down to Earth, it basically magnifies the effect of the solar radiation and causes and means that less of the sun's heat can actually get radiated back out into space. Now, the greenhouse effect isn't all bad. It's actually a natural thing. The trouble is that we've put more carbon in the form of carbon dioxide and methane into the atmosphere than there used to be. So the greenhouse effect is actually now caused something that used to be. Well, now that we've talked about the different approaches to global warming and about the causes and effects and mitigation and adaptation and the role of carbon, that leads us to here. The bulk of scientific research worldwide ascribes global warming to human causes. And this is perhaps, I think, probably the most controversial statement that I've made today. A lot of people don't believe it. But basically, why did this happen? We as a society, worldwide economy for the last almost 200 years we've burned huge amounts of fossil fuels such as coal, oil, and natural gas. And that the byproduct, the combustion product of that is carbon dioxide, among other things. And it has definitely increased the amount of the percent of carbon dioxide in our atmosphere. Some people think if we try to solve this by going away from using fossil fuels, convert from fossil fuels to renewable energy, it'll ruin the national economy and the world economy. But attitudes are changing. So when I say attitudes are changing, I'm referring to a very well-respected, long-running survey called Global Warming's 6 Americas. And here's a graph showing a 5-year trend of national surveys from the year 2015 to 2020. And this was the 6 Americas annual surveys is run by the Yale University Program for Climate Change Communication. The 6 Americas that represent the attitudes of, if you divide the American public up by broad categories, 6 categories. At the bottom of this chart, you have those who are alarmed or concerned about climate change. At the top, you have people that don't really care about it. They're dismissive or doubtful that it even happens. Disengaged, they just don't even pay any attention to it. And then there's some in the middle that are cautious. During the past 5 years, during the previous 5 years, the number of people, the percentage of people who were in 2015 concerned or alarmed about climate change was only 41%. And 2020, that had grown from 41% up to 53%, 54%. That's a big rise, and this trend is continuing. Uh, so I think that the fact that uh, mitigation it's hard, it's difficult. This country and nations around the world, in particular Europe, are really coming to the idea that we need to do something big to mitigate climate change.
Well, with attitudes and opinions changing more and more rapidly, both in this country and in other countries, including Europe, people are spending more time talking about the different responses that we could make to global climate change. Uh, one of those, an example of one of those ideas, it's actually been looked at before, but it's been in Congress and bills, but it's never been passed. The method is called carbon pricing, also referred to as a carbon fee. This would add a little bit of a fee to the price of fossil fuels to pay for the pollution that they create, which buyers haven't been paying in the past. This is actually favored by economists. In fact, 3,500 economists have publicly endorsed this strategy for mitigating and reducing climate emissions, greenhouse gas emissions. Other groups that are endorsing this more and more are business groups, local businesses. Also, the U.S. Chamber of Commerce has a group called the Business Roundtable. And also another group, the Federal Commodity Futures Trading Commission, recently issued a report. And these are saying that they favor the pricing of carbon, uh, uh, basically increasing the price of the fossil fuels. So again, the carbon we're referring to here is the carbon in fossil fuels, which will put more carbon dioxide into our atmosphere. Uh, Fossil fuels are relatively cheap now because buyers don't pay the true cost of burning them. Economists call this a market failure uh, because the future costs or external costs, uh, such as the cost of future economic disruption, they're not being paid by us. They're going to be paid by our children and the generation of our grandchildren because they're going to face huge consequences. So if the government passed carbon pricing in a bill, they could add a fee per ton of fossil fuels, basically looking at the amount of carbon pollution, carbon dioxide they'd release into the atmosphere. This would increase the price of coal, oil, and natural gas. It would increase it gradually but steadily. Businesses will know that this fee is going to go up over the years. And this is going to cause both businesses and people to switch rapidly to cheaper, cleaner, renewable energy sources for our energy. And this is actually going to, it's not going to ruin the economy. It's going to create uh, a lot of jobs all over the country. It's actually going to improve our economy. Uh, so another aspect of carbon pricing that's included in some bills that were before Congress in the last session. One of them is called border adjustments. If we had a carbon fee, which might increase our energy costs a little bit, if a country, some other country that wanted to export goods to the United States, say a country like China, if they didn't have a carbon fee, uh, our 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 government would levy a tariff on their goods equivalent to the amount of carbon pollution, the cost of that carbon pollution for them making those goods. It would level the playing field for our business producers, and it would make a huge incentive for all other exporting countries to institute their own carbon fees. So this carbon pricing would become virtually worldwide, which would have a huge effect on rapidly driving down the level of greenhouse gas emissions so that we could reach a goal of having no carbon emissions by 2050, which is the goal of the IPCC. So by paying these costs now, and we might pay a little higher energy prices at the pump and for our electricity, we can prevent much higher future costs, which are probably going to fall on our children and grandchildren's generation. And this is something which we should know about because there is increasing attention being paid to this nationally. I want to thank the Carson River Coalition for putting this session on, and I really very much look forward to hearing what the other presenters have to say today. Thank you.